Hello, everybody. Welcome on the Lights on Data show. Today, we're going to talk about how to present data in the right way. And to do so, we have here Christopher Chin. Christopher, welcome.
Thanks so much, George, for having me on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for being on the Lights on Data show. It's quite surreal. I've been watching a lot of your videos, a lot of the content that you're putting out there on making great presentations, presenting data in the right way. So it's an honor to have you on the show.
Likewise, I've been following your show for a while and wanting to be a guest. So having this moment now is also surreal to me.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about you, because you really help transform tech professionals into star speakers, right? So you've been leveraging your years of experience in the data storytelling, data science, and data visualization fields. And now you're really offering those specialized public speaking and presentations coaching, which is something that I think a lot of us need.
Yeah, my journey started in a very different field, in actually music composition and acoustic engineering. And I'd say that now what I bring is a very particular skill set that situates me between technology and the business. So in that sense, I have the data analytics experience, which lets me know how to get things done. But I also have this experience in this very totally far left field in music composition that informs how to make that impactful. So from my experience in music, writing music, performing music, what I'm always thinking about is the audience experience of what I'm giving them. And
Brilliant.
Using that, I have this idea about not only giving information as we do in presentations, but also how that information is received by any kind of audience. So over the time that I've had in the industry, in the data industry, I always try to focus on not only what I'm presenting, but also how the audience is processing that information that I'm giving them.
Brilliant. Quite a few data professionals seems to have an inkling into the music industry for whatever reason. Tian Kai, that we've had on the show before, who sings about data governance. We have Dan Ever, who's putting all these fun songs together. Joe Reese, whenever I see him on camera, he has 10 instruments behind him. So I think all of you need to get together at one point and use your talents, combining that with the data field. So Chris, let's go back on the topic on presenting data in the right way. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the misconceptions that we're seeing with presentations?
Definitely. I think it would be best to maybe start off with a story where I was a first-year college student, and I was a promising pre-med student at that time. I remember the first time I walked into a lecture hall, and it was enormous. Probably the most people I've seen packed in a room, because I come from a relatively small high school with about 200 kids per grade. And in this lecture hall, there were about 400 students, all packed in. The seats were so close that you could literally look over your shoulder and just casually look if you were taking a test and you could see someone else's answers. It was that close, the tables next to each other. And the professor I had, this was for General Chemistry 1, intended for the pre-med track. And this was a kind, earnest professor who really cared about his students, really cared about his material. But over the course of his lecture series, I got my first professional and academic taste of death by PowerPoint, which is an affliction that affects so many presentations in our industry and in many technical industries. And in death by PowerPoint, what that means is you're watching a presentation live, usually in PowerPoint, and there's just so much text on the slide for you to process that you're unable to identify the important information and come away knowing what to do about it. So in this lecture series, the presenter, my professor, would put all of the information he wanted to convey on the slides. He would read those slides word for word, and he would email the slide deck out to the students just before the lecture. So they would have everything they needed to be prepared. So you can imagine the lecture started off as a 400 people crowd at the beginning of the semester. And by the end, maybe about 10 or so people stayed for the live sessions because there was no longer any point to attend. If you have all the information emailed to you beforehand, why attend a presentation where someone just reads it word for word? And what I hope that example demonstrates is that a presentation is not about giving information. If it was, my professor would have done a stellar job, an absolutely 100% perfect job of giving information. But a presentation is not about giving information. It's about inspiring some kind of action in your audience. And in this case, the action would have been, okay, I want to inform my audience about general chemistry, let's say, but I want to inspire them to go on to future classes. I want them to inspire them to take on future careers in biology, chemistry, pre-med, whatever it may be. So it's important to think about presentations as not just delivering cold, hard facts, but wrapping them up in an emotionally engaging way that people can process it and go on to do something about it. And this comes down to the question of, why is the presenter necessary in the first place? In this example with the professor, he was not necessary at all because he emailed all the information to the audience beforehand. So why does any presenter, for that matter, you and I right now presenting in this podcast, why do we need to be here? I could have just sent you a talking list of points, everything I wanted to say today to everyone in this audience, and they would have all the information that they need. But my purpose here, your purpose here, is to convey the information we want in an emotionally engaging way, using our voice, using our body language, the way we structure our information. They're all intended to take that raw information and make the audience inspired to do something about it.
Brilliant. And you've done it, I think, perfectly through a story, because already as you started to tell it, I was engaged, I was drawn, I wanted to listen, pay attention to what you're going to say. Great start to proving that point. So to reiterate, what is the purpose of a presentation?
The purpose of a presentation is, again, not to give information. It would be to inspire some kind of action. And you might say, not all presentations need to inspire action, right? There's typically presentations that are informational, educational, persuasive, or motivational. And persuasive and motivational, you can see how they're trying to persuade you to do something after the end of the presentation. But for informational or educational, that's where there's this line where you're saying, oh, well, I'm just giving an information about something, right? But an example I'd like to give is a story that actually happened to me in the workplace. My manager asked me, can you make a presentation about the project you worked on this month? Now, if you just went into that and said, okay, I can put down a slide deck, I can put all the information on the slides, and then I'll be ready to go. That is not what a presentation is about. What you need to do in those kinds of situations, and what I did in that instance, is say, hey, wait, hold on, don't leave yet. Tell me what the purpose of this presentation is. Who is my audience? Who am I presenting to? What is their level of technical proficiency? And what action do you want them to take after hearing my presentation? Those guiding questions are what should dictate how you design any kind of presentation. Because with knowledge of those guiding questions, then you can say, okay, I should tailor my presentation to maybe a more non-technical audience. If the audience wants to use my project in their own work, then I need to make sure that I address how to do that. Instead of just telling them what I did, tell them how to implement it. So you see how thinking not just about what you're being asked, but thinking about what the real meaning behind it is, that's what's so important in any kind of presentation design.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know about you, but I think, at least myself as a data professional, sometimes I'm plagued by the fact that I think so much information needs to go on there, because there's so many different facets of that data that I want to present for whatever purpose would be, that it's way too much, it's overwhelming. And often because of that, whoever's listening to that presentation, watching those slides, they're lost, right? They see the whole forest and each individual tree, and they're not getting the message out there. So do you have any best practices, especially for data professionals, that can adopt to present their work a little bit better?
Yeah, that's an excellent example of where technical professionals in particular struggle with this aspect of presentation design, because as technical professionals, we want to be as thorough as possible. We want to make sure our code is perfect, no bug has been missed, every parenthesis has been closed. But the problem with that way of thinking is that when it comes time to present, our audience doesn't speak that same language to us often. We're not always presenting to fellow developers. We're often presenting to managers and executives who care about very different things. So I would encourage presentation designers at a technical level to think about not only how you accomplished what you did, but why it matters to the person you're presenting to. So really asking those guiding questions I mentioned before. What is the purpose of the presentation? What are they going to do with the information I'm giving to them? And how can I tailor my presentation to address those pain points? So instead of starting a presentation with saying, oh, I used this Python library, it took X hours to process, it took Y hours to complete, and this is all the work that I did, the value is really obtained not in what you did, but why it matters to the person who's listening to it. So if you started off with all that information, but didn't say, okay, all of the things that I did, they expedited the previous process by 50%. 50% increase in efficiency. If you start off like that, then the person at the other end is immediately interested. They know why it matters to them. So reorganizing in your mind about the order of information, talking about why it matters first, then giving the supporting details later, that's a better way to approach structuring a presentation.
Well said. And as an add-on to that, Ravid of the Ravid Show is wondering, what is the most important thing to remember while presenting data to C-suite business leaders?
That's an excellent question. And it comes down to, again, that question of why. So executives have very limited time. If you start talking about any kind of project that you're working in, all the technical details, they'll just leave the room because that's not what they're interested in. You need to address what they're there for. They want to know how to increase profit. They want to know how to increase sales, how to decrease time, increase efficiency. If you can address that in the first few seconds of your presentation with a really good, solid intro, then that's what they really want to listen to. And how I usually approach introduction is the same way. A lot of people worry about, oh, how do I start a presentation? Do I start with a joke? Do I start with a story? Maybe a rhetorical question, a shocking statistic? These are all things that we worry about, but it really comes down to thinking about what is the emotion that you want to elicit in your audience. So for someone in the C-suite, you want them to be excited about the project you're working in. Oh, I did this amazing thing. This is how much value it brings. State that at the very beginning. That's how you start. Or if you want the C-suite executive to be really frustrated, say, okay, this is where we were before, really bad before. This is our ideal after, where we're going to go now that I implemented this process. This is how we can improve. So thinking about things in terms of those frameworks is so important to good presentation design.
Well said, well said. So we should always remember that emotion and try to appeal to that emotion that we're trying to evoke into the other person, deliver the presentation that way. And something maybe to add, Chris, is that presentation slide deck that you were mentioning earlier on, that's not necessarily your presentation. That's has a supporting role in delivering your presentation.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more with that. And I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings in presentation is that the slide deck is the presentation itself. I myself have been asked many times by a manager, make a slide deck so that for our presentation, we're ready to go. But the slide deck is not the presentation itself. If you think of it that way, then they end up with walls of text that just bore the audience and you read it word for word.
Right.
If you think instead about a presentation as the outline in your mind of what you want to say, and then afterwards you create slides to support that argument, that makes for a more effective experience. Because what happens there is then the slides complement what you're saying instead of just repeating it. And I think what you mentioned before about emotion is also so important. A lot of times in the tech field or in research fields, scientific fields, people feel very strongly about sticking to the cold, hard, objective facts. And that's absolutely fine, and it should be advocated that way. We need to approach things in scientifically, statistically, to make sure our results are reproducible and accurate. However, when you're presenting about those processes, it doesn't have to be emotionless. It doesn't have to be cold, hard, and scientific. It has to bring in the emotion that you want to elicit in the audience. So it's important to look at the process you use to get your data differently from the way you present about that data. Because for the process part, you're just working with numbers and code. For the presentation part, you're working with people, and people don't respond to facts, they respond to feelings.
Right. Yeah, Brunson here is mentioning that an overloaded slide deck is probably an overcompensation for poor communication skills, whether intentional or unintentional. Maybe. Let's try and dissect that. What do you think people put so much information on the slide deck? My assumption is it's easier for them, right? It's so much easier to read off the slide deck. It reduces maybe the nerves. You don't need to rehearse as much. You're confident that even if you get lost, oh, I can just go to the second bullet point and just read it out loud. Easy for me. Another reason might be that you might want to leave people with some sort of a handout, digital or not, and this is the way to do it. But I don't think those need to be two in one. You can always have, if you want, a sort of a one-page or two-pager notes outline or whatever you want them to take away with them after the presentation that you can print or email as a PDF, follow up after. You don't need to put all on the slides. And of course, you can put all those notes if you're nervous, not on the slide itself, but in the note section that you can refer to when you're presenting.
Absolutely. And I think a good example of that is a story I had with a client I was working with. He was creating a slide deck focused around an online course that he had developed. And in the purpose of this presentation was to tell his audience about it so that they understood what the online course was about and why they should sign up for it. One of the slides that he put together was filled with text about who this course is for, what you can do within it, all the steps in each module of the course. And it was all text that he just read word for word. And I had him record himself presenting that section of the presentation. And I said to him, I want you to listen to this and tell me what you think. And he said to me, oh, listening to it, I realized that I could have delivered that a little better. I tripped up on a few of the words as I was reading the paragraph. I could have paused a little more for the important words that I was reading. And I said, no, don't think about your performance. Think about how the audience is receiving it. So think about putting yourself in the listener's shoes, not about how you're delivering the information. And he said, oh, and he listened to it again. He said, okay, yeah, it's a little tedious watching myself read it word for word because you as the listener, you as the viewer of the slide can read so much faster than the speaker can speak.
Right.
So you've read it already and you're watching them laboriously go word to word. And I said, so what I want to point out here is the importance of structuring your slides as just visual support for your oral delivery. Focus on the keywords you want to emphasize, step through those, and don't include all this information that you're just going to say anyway. What you mentioned before, George, about the importance of a handout, I strongly advocate for that approach, because what has happened a lot in the industry, what I've experienced myself, is a manager will ask me to put together a slide deck. And they've asked me to put more information on it so that when I email it later, people have a reference. But my argument to that is this: if you're trying to make a slide deck be both support for a live presentation and a reference later, it will fail at being both. So you think you're saving time by creating one product for both use cases, but you're actually wasting everybody's time because it can't be good at both those things. Create one slide deck for your live presentation and create one handout that has all of the links, all the information you want people to reference. That way, it's a simple 1-2 pager they can easily look at instead of scrolling through an entire slide deck. So it's important to really distinguish between those two things.
As you're mentioning this, I realize this is really what happens sometimes when dashboards get developed and you're working with those stakeholders and you're asking them what they want, and they keep on adding things and more, and it comes to, you got to keep on scrolling to see everything that they've asked for. And at the end, it's so overwhelming. You don't know what the purpose of the dashboard is in the first place, because it can answer anything and everything at once. But then you as the end user don't really know how to best utilize it. And it's because of that overwhelming of information. We're really putting too much on there. So let's move on to then, how do we best present facts to our audience? What are some tips and tricks that you want to share?
Yeah, I'll give an example. So if I were to say to you something like this: I'm a data professional with about 5 years of experience in the field. I started out in data science, working in artificial intelligence, and then I went on to become a data journalist. And I did some work for the Department of Transportation, finding stories to tell the public about. And then finally, I made a pit stop in data visualization, where I felt like my skill set was perfectly suited to creating dashboards and reports for businesses and organizations. You wouldn't care about any of that because I just listed a bunch of things that I did, just a bunch of list of facts. What's missing there is myself, my passion, what makes it interesting, the why that connects all of those facts together. So if I said instead something like this: my passion ever since a young age has always been about communication. And when I discovered the data industry, I realized that businesses are sitting on terabytes, petabytes of data, raw data that has actionable insights that can change the business profitability, increase revenue, make for better outcomes. And my role as a data visualization engineer or as a business intelligence associate will be to take that raw data and turn it into actionable insight for those organizations. Now, with that kind of framing, that it's not just the what, but there's a why that wraps everything together, my passion for communication. So in any presentation, I would encourage professionals to think about not just what they want to say, but the why that connects all of them together, the why that underlies why we're having this presentation in the first place.
That's perfect. And adding to that, like you mentioned before, is depending who your audience is, to try and look at what's in it for me type of a thing. As everybody that's watching something, listening to something, they're asking that, why should I watch this? Why should I listen to it? Why should I care about it? What's in it for me? And as soon as you're targeting that, you make that clear to them, you're engaging them, you're hooking them in, they're more likely to listen to the message that you want to deliver to them.
Exactly. And I think another good example of that is thinking about, again, that example of dashboards and stakeholders. That was an excellent example of another instance of presentation. For dashboards, an instance that happened to me, a story that happened to me in the industry, was I was working with some stakeholders. They asked me, I want you to create a dashboard that has a metric showing what jobs took the longest. And by jobs, I don't mean employment, jobs in the essence of automated tasks in a workflow. So they said, give me a dashboard and I want you to show a sorted list, all the jobs that took the longest. I could have easily gone in and done that. But again, it comes back to those guiding questions. Dig deeper and figure out, what are they actually asking for? So I went back to the stakeholder and I said, so what action do you want to take using the information that I'm providing? And they said, we want to identify what jobs had errors. So that's a completely different story. We're now talking about duration. Maybe that metric you asked me for is not necessarily the best one for the job. And I said, if you want that, what I can do instead is give you a metric that has the duration, but divides and normalizes by the volume of data processed. Because if I didn't do that, if I just showed you pure duration, You would have a sorted list of all the jobs that took the longest simply because they processed more data, not because they had errors. So if I show you this new metric that normalizes that out, then you'll have exactly the information that you need. And they say, okay, yes, that's what we actually need. So it comes down to not just accepting the requirements you're given, but digging deeper and asking the bigger why behind it.
Well said. Dan Everett is quoting here, love the presentation is not a deck, which maybe is the reason why we don't have a deck today.
Yes.
Monica is again reiterating, presentation isn't about giving information, it's about inspiring an audience, like you said, Chris. Absolutely. And Kristen, 100%, when you realize people are more interested in themselves and their problems, you're golden.
Yeah, another example I like to give for this is show, don't tell. So this is like the cardinal rule in screenwriting. And as an example, there in Star Wars, if you watched it in the second movie, there is a scene where the main character Anakin is talking to his love interest Padme, and he says something along the lines of, this is horrible paraphrasing, but he says something along the lines of, I love you so much, and the feelings inside are tearing me apart. I can't bear to sit next to you with these feelings. That is just horrible writing from the standpoint of just saying what the character is feeling. You're just telling the audience what you want them to know about. But instead of doing that, what you need to do is you need to show them those same feelings. So instead, if the main character Anakin, instead if he did something to demonstrate his love for his love interest, if she was having a stressful day at work, and then he said, you know what, I got the cooking today, something along those lines where he is demonstrating his feelings without actually saying it explicitly, that is the important thing to do in screenwriting and also for presentation. Don't just list a bunch of facts, actually show the person why those facts are important when seen together.
Said, and great example. And in his defense, he killed all the younglings afterwards to prove that.
Yes.
Anyways, I am a big Star Wars fan
So
too, by the way. All right. Chris, what is your favorite part when you're putting a presentation together, when you're improving a data visualization? What's your favorite part of that process?
My favorite part is always the aha moment where I can see the light bulb click in the audience's mind. And this all comes down to that idea of structure that I was talking about before. A lot of people will look at a presentation like, okay, I can talk about this bullet point, then this bullet point, then this bullet point. But I encourage my clients when we review presentations to think about it not as a bullet pointed list, but as stairs that you're building up to something. So start with the main point, the aha moment that you want to convey. That's the part where the audience will walk away and say, oh, I learned something new. I know what to do now. And then build your information up to that. Say, okay, with that information, this is what I can introduce before that, supporting detail to make them interested about this insight. And then even before that, introduce even more background detail. So it's about building the audience up to a moment instead of just conveying information. That experience is my favorite part about presentation design.
Wonderful. We have a question here coming from Twitch, and they're asking, have you used ChatGPT at all to try and improve the presentation delivery? And if so, do you have any tips on the prompt or anything like that?
I love that question. I haven't used ChatGPT yet for presentation design. Now, I've heard a lot of content creators on LinkedIn using it to write posts and things. I haven't gotten on that boat yet. I probably should. But what I usually say is any tool that can help facilitate your workflow, might as well use it. There's nothing wrong with having help when it comes to writing, when it comes to presentation. So I highly recommend people to check it out. I personally, though, have not had experience.
Thank you. It's funny, I think for at least a month now, I think on every episode, somebody has asked something related to ChatGPT on whatever topic that we covered. So I think it's something we'll see more and more. Yavin is mentioning this has been really good. I've felt through presentation. I'd rather talk about the image and the story, that image being a chart, a graph, metric, what have you, as I feel people are visual and understand shapes and colors versus reading text and then listening. Doing two things at once is tough.
Absolutely. The thing with presentation is you have the visuals and you have yourself, and they have to work together instead of fighting or repeating each other. So people can't read text on your slide and listen to you at the same time. So a good recommendation that I have is keep the words on your text very limited. So maybe 20 words or less. That way people can just read it in a few seconds and then you talk about it. And what you also mentioned about shapes, colors, visuals, that is the way to design a good slide, because the same principle goes for dashboards. People process visual information very quickly. If you see a chart and you see a line going up, you know something is improving. Whereas if you just showed that same information in the table, that insight doesn't pop out the same way because it's not as visual. And the same goes if you just wrote that in text. Maybe people won't see visually that line increasing. So yes, visual charts and graphs, they're definitely the way to go when it comes to slides.
Somebody told me once, and this was pre-pandemic when we were having most of those presentations in person and we didn't have the Zoom Teams or whatever we were using. But they told me this, George, if you see that during your presentation, people are looking, 90% at your slide deck and not at you speaking and delivering that presentation, then maybe you got to tweak that presentation slide a little bit more and have maybe a bit less emphasis on what you're putting out there and more into the message that you are delivering through your voice. What do you think about that?
That's a fantastic recommendation. And I think the pandemic and going completely remote for everyone really exacerbated a lot of presentation tendencies, because what happened was we all became virtual and digital. The slides, virtual and digital products. Ourselves, we became virtual and digital products. Right now, as we're speaking, my image is bits and bytes streamed across the internet. My voice is bits and bytes streamed across the internet. Everything is virtual and digital. And what happened was during meetings, we found that people became so much less engaged. They're not a literal live captive audience in the room. Now we have all these distractions. We can look around and do anything during a meeting. In order to keep people engaged, we found that you need to interact with the audience. You need to have more polls, interactive breakout sessions, things like that to keep people interested in what you have to say. And the presentation is not the slide deck itself, it's your delivery of it. And what I encourage a lot of clients to do is to not create the slide deck first and then rehearse. I encourage them to think about the outline in their mind of what they want to say and then create the slides to support that. Because if you get it that way, that ensures that you don't let the slides lead the presentation instead of yourself.
Well said. In your practice, do you help people with putting their slide deck together?
Yeah, I devote a good amount of time in my sessions to slide deck improvement. What I've seen is that, especially in technical and research fields, there's a lot of that tendency to put a lot of the text on the slide, act as speaker notes as referenced during the presentation. And it's really a mindset shift. I say, we got to flip the table around. It's not about you. It's not about what you're presenting. It's about how your audience is listening to the information and what they're going to do about it. So I say, reverse it. If you were to listen to your own presentation, what would you want to see? You wouldn't want to see someone reading word for word. You want to see just walls of text. You would want to see something visual, so you immediately get the message, and then you talk through those points. So it is definitely a huge component about making a good presentation, is the slides.
Yeah, as Daniel is mentioning here, great advice. Message first, then slides. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming on the show and imparting all this knowledge and golden nuggets with us. Where can people find you, follow your content, and just learn more about you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can follow my profile. I also have my website, thehiddenspeaker.com, where I have more free resources on presentation, data storytelling, data visualization. So feel free to check those out.
Thank you. And I do encourage to follow Chris on LinkedIn because he is providing a lot of free and great content for all of us to learn from. So please keep doing that for our own sake. And thank you for everything that you do.
Yeah, thanks so much, George, for having me on the show. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend ahead. Cheers.